Dead by Daylight is an asymmetrical multiplayer game. On one team, you have 4 survivors. They have to repair 5 generators, power an exit gate, and escape the trial alive. On the other team, you have 1 player. They play as the killer. The killer's job is to kill all of the survivors by sacrificing them on these hooks. Hooking someone 3 times kills them out of the game. The killer has what's called a terror radius, a big circle around them that follows them everywhere they go. When a survivor is within this circle, they hear a heartbeat and some music. The louder it is, the closer the killer is, giving the survivors a bit of a heads up that the killer is nearby. The concept is really simple, but tons of depth emerges from such simplicity, and today I wanted to take a deep dive into what makes Dead by Daylight such an incredible game. Now to start with, I want to talk about that simplicity, because I honestly think that this simplicity is what makes Dead by Daylight such a fascinating and fun game. The game mechanics are extraordinarily simple. The survivors spend a large portion of the game holding down left click on generators, holding down left click to heal teammates, holding down left click to cleanse totems, just holding down left click to save the day. The killer's role is a little bit more complicated, since each killer has a unique power that makes them play differently to everybody else. Understanding how to use these powers is important for success, and having the mechanical skill required to chase and hit survivors is important too. But even so, it's still conceptually very simple. But these few simple game mechanics cause such a complex gameplay loop to emerge. In a chase, all you're doing in essence is chasing or running away from your opponent. But despite that, the way chases play out ends up being extremely complicated. Most killers are melee characters. They don't have any form of ranged attack whatsoever. They need to close the distance with a survivor to hit them. But survivors can run around obstacles to gain distance on the killer. Sure, the killer's faster, ever so slightly, than the survivor is, but if the survivor runs you well, you'll have a very hard time catching up. Survivors can jump through windows to escape the killer. The killer can also vault these windows, but they do it much slower than the survivors do, giving the survivors an edge around a window. Survivors can also drop these pallets. It blocks the pathway and creates a vaultable object in the middle. If you drop one directly on the killer, it stuns them for a moment. Again, these things are very simple mechanics, but despite that simplicity, there's tons of really clever strategies that emerge from it. You can run towards a window, make it look like you're gonna vault, and then swerve away last second, making the killer miss his swing. The killer is in first person, whereas the survivor is in third person. So good survivors can wait around corners so that the killer can't see them, but they can see the killer. The killer has a red light coming out of their face called the red stain. Survivors can see that red light coming around a corner before they can see the killer themselves. So paying attention to this red light gives you an extra way to spot where they're coming from. But the killer knows this, so a good killer can show their light coming around one corner, then walk back the other way and cut the survivor off. Or they can turn corners backwards to give the survivor less time to see them coming. There's tons of crazy stunts like this that can take place in a match, and that's not even mentioning certain character-specific craziness that can happen. These extremely simple game mechanics created such an incredibly skill-expressive and complicated game. It's genius design. But now, you know, I actually don't have a segue to the next bit, so, the progression system. Dead by Daylight's progression system is very interesting. You have 3 in-game currencies. These 2 are obtained just by playing the game. These are iridescent shards. They let you unlock perks, cosmetics, and characters without having to spend real-world money to do so. These are auric cells. They buy all of the same things that the shards do, but you can spend real money to buy them. These are blood points. They allow you to level up a certain character through the blood web. And the blood web is basically just a randomly generated skill tree that lets you unlock perks, items, offerings, and add-ons for the one character. Each time you buy enough things in this single tree, you level up and you get the next tree to go through. Each character has its own blood web separate from each other character, and each character has 3 unique perks for that one character. Once you hit level 30, 35, and 40, you unlock that character's teachable perks, which essentially lets you find those perks in other characters' blood webs. This, all in theory, sounds very good, but in practice it has felt like quite a large barrier to me, and it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of new players were massively turned off by this progression system. Let me give you an example. This is barbecue and chili. It's a perk for killer, a perk for Leatherface, to be precise. It's extremely good for a lot of killers. I went through the blood web on Leatherface to unlock this perk, and now I want to go play Oni and use this perk on him. Problem is, I can't use this perk. Despite the fact that I already unlocked this perk, I literally already own it, I can't actually play with it just because this randomly generated progression tree decided not to allow me to unlock it for this one killer. It's not like I'm being punished for doing something wrong, and it's not like I don't already own the perk. It just decided not to show up in this one blood web this one time. The fact that these trees are randomly generated means that I can just get unlucky and not be allowed to use the perk that I've already unlocked in the first place. It could at least let me use the yellow version of this perk, but no, I just have to keep sinking in-game currency into this progression tree just because I'm unlucky. The amount of blood points required to level a character to unlock their perks is already enormous, so having to re-unlock said perks for every individual character is a large ask in my opinion. Progression systems in games are great, because it keeps the player engaged, it keeps them coming back, and it makes them feel like they're working towards a goal. It's great for player retention, but make a progression system a bit too grindy and you'll alienate new players. Make it gate out too much content and people won't want to progress through it at all. Dead by Daylight system is pretty good though, it wouldn't need much changing. Leveling up a single character doesn't take too long, it's leveling up a large number of them that becomes tedious. You could make it so that the web costs less to level through, or you could make it so that if you've already unlocked a teachable perk, then you can automatically use at least the yellow version for everyone. The system just feels like it's arbitrarily gating me from content for seemingly no reason. This is the sort of problem that veteran players will barely even notice. They've already unlocked everything, and they have a bajillion blood points, so they don't care. But the veteran players are the loudest voices in the community. But they're also the least affected by this sort of problem. It's the new players that are impacted by it. So things like this might not get brought up as issues as often as maybe they should. I really like Dead by Daylight, but I prefer playing Survivor over Killer. But if I do want to start playing a bit of Killer, then I have to use blood points to level up a Killer. The same blood points that I've been using to level up Survivors. It becomes a very time-consuming affair that doesn't really benefit the player in any way. It ends up feeling like I'm being restricted from content that I've already unlocked for no real reason, which is unfortunate for a game that has so many interesting combinations of perks to run. So let's talk about that, shall we? The perks. We talked about the complexity that comes from the chase mechanics, so now let's talk about the complexity that comes from perks. There's tons of perks in this game, but they all synergize in very interesting ways. Killer perks, in my opinion, end up being a lot more interesting, because for Survivor, every character is exactly the same. They have access to the same items and add-ons, and they move at the exact same speed. The only differences between characters is how they look, how they sound, and what their teachable perks are. But for Killer, each character is completely different to each other character. The killers all have differing powers from one another, meaning that certain perks will inherently synergize better with some killers than others. Let's take this perk for example. It's called Monitor and Abuse. This perk makes it so that while you're not chasing a survivor, your terror radius, that heartbeat that the survivors can hear, is much smaller. This allows you to get closer to survivors before they realize that you're coming. However, whilst you're in a chase, your terror radius is much bigger, making survivors from even further away know that you're around. This perk is extremely good on certain killers. Let's take Deathslinger, for example. Deathslinger has a ranged attack that lets him shoot survivors and reel them towards him to get a hit. Being able to get as close as possible to a survivor before they realise you're coming is obviously extremely good for a character who has a ranged attack. This perk, however, is not so good on other characters, like Wraith for example. Wraith's power allows him to go into stealth, which makes him invisible from far away and only a shimmer when up close. This also removes his terror radius while it's active. Running a perk that shrinks your terror radius on a character that can just remove their terror radius at will is obviously not very good, right? Killers also have hex perks. Essentially, a hex perk is a perk that has a powerful effect, but survivors can remove that effect from the game. There's these totems around the map. When one of them is glowing like this, it means that that's a hex totem. Survivors can destroy these totems to remove your perk from the game. This allows the devs to create extremely powerful game-altering perks while still giving the survivors counterplay. And this works great. most of the time, but we'll get to that later. These character-specific builds don't really exist for survivors, since all survivors play exactly the same. What survivors and killers both have, however, is perk synergy. Something like Inner Strength and Small Game. Inner Strength lets you heal after doing a totem. Small Game helps you find totems. Synergy. There's lots of way more ridiculous synergies that exist in this game, and they give the game a ton of depth on top of the depth that it already had. But unfortunately, when it comes to perks, for both Survivor and Killer, a lot of these synergies can often be overshadowed by the sheer strength of any individual perk. Which is where I get onto the inevitable part of every case study video. Or at least, any part of the only two I've ever made, my guess. Balance. Dead by Daylight, unsurprisingly, is full of balance issues, just as many games are. Being an asymmetrical multiplayer game makes balancing your game much harder than your average multiplayer game, and Dead by Daylight, all things considered, is doing a great job, a much better job than any other asymmetrical game I've ever seen. But compared to your average multiplayer game, there are quite a few balance issues. Because if your goal is to win, why would you run a cool and creative synergy build when you can just run 4 extremely good perks? These perks don't necessarily have incredible synergy together, but they are just individually strong to the point where I can happily run them without really feeling like I'm at any disadvantage. Let's take this one, for example. Decisive Strike. A survivor, for 60 seconds after being unhooked, will receive a skill check after they get picked up off the ground by the killer. If they land the skill check, they escape the killer's grasp and they stun him. This is obviously extremely powerful. It buys tons of time for your team, and it forces the killer to waste even more time if he wants to try and play around this perk. Or what about Borrowed Time? After unhooking a survivor, the unhooked survivor can tank a hit without going down for the next 12 seconds. These two perks don't necessarily synergize incredibly well with each other. They're just very strong individually. Now, I don't actually think that these two perks need to be nerfed. They've both received a lot of changes in the past, and I personally think that they're in a good spot at the moment, even if they're on the stronger side. But the real problem comes from the fact that so many perks are just abysmally weak in comparison. Like Bite the Bullet. Being quiet while healing and not being punished for missing skill checks is extremely insignificant when compared to something as massive as taking an extra hit or stunning the killer after being downed. There's even some perks that fulfill the exact same role, it's just that one of them is much worse than the other one. Let's take Adrenaline versus Hope. With Adrenaline, you will instantly heal a health state after the final generator is finished. Even if you're downed, you just get up and you run away instantly. You also get a speed boost for a few seconds. Hope makes it so that after the final generator is finished, you run 7% faster for 2 minutes. Don't get me wrong, Hope is not a bad perk, it's pretty good, it's just noticeably weaker than Adrenaline is. For the most part, the weak perks need to be buffed rather than the strong ones needing nerfs. But there's other things that I hate about this game's balancing too. Things that aren't necessarily overpowered, but they're just so anti-fun that I really don't think they should exist in their current state in Dead by Daylight. For example, no one escapes death. This is a killer perk. After the final generator is completed, the killer will instantly down any survivor they hit for the remainder of the game. This perk, quite frankly, is an abomination. If my teammate is on a hook at the end of a match, the correct play for me to make would be to try and save them. Maybe I tank a hit for them as they run away off the hook, help them escape by body blocking, stuff like that. But if the killer has this perk, I will be punished for making that play. The killer has a perk that actively punishes the survivors for working as a team in the late game. Not to mention that it allows the killer to waste a lot of time in the early game, chasing one survivor and camping them to death, just because they know that their stupid perk will allow them to make a comeback later on. The perk incentivizes killers to play the most boring, passive, uninteractive game possible, and it's extremely hard to play around. No One Escapes Death is a hex perk, meaning that survivors can find and cleanse the totems to get rid of it, but the totem only lights up while it's active. So before the last generator is done, you have no way to know that it's there until someone gets hit by it. If I were to change this perk, that's one of the changes I might make. Make the totem light up at the beginning of the game just like any other hex perk. Or maybe make it light up at the second gen or something. Just before it's actually active, it should light up. Another possible change would be to make it so that you're rewarded for getting hooks. Maybe you get one insta-down per unique survivor hooked throughout the game. So if you hook all 4 survivors, you get 4 insta-downs at the end of the game. This would prevent killers from just camping one guy to death and then running a rampage with no one escapes death at the end of the game. This perk's existence incentivizes survivors to play selfishly in a game that's all about teamwork, and it incentivizes the killer to play in the most boring and uninteractive way possible. Without a rework, this perk will continue to ruin my matches for the rest of time. Another example of anti-fun game design is with Michael Myers' Tombstone add-ons. This add-on allows Myers to straight up kill survivors with the 3rd tier of his power. So instead of having to chase you, down you, hook you 3 times, all he has to do is stalk you to tier 3, walk up to you, and just left click you. And you just die, as if you were hooked 3 times. You don't even need to be injured, he just kills you. Essentially, losing a single chase in the entire match kills you instantly. Completely uninteractive, boring to play against. It's not necessarily overpowered, because the survivors do have counterplay before the Myers has fully stalked to tier 3, but it's not fun to play against in any way otherwise. Dead by Daylight used to have a lot of this stuff, more than it has right now, which gives me hope that they'll make future changes to remove or rework these sorts of things out of the game. But I don't think any survivor has ever had fun against a Myers running these 2 add-ons, because it makes you instantly lose the entire match the moment you lose 1 chase. There's plenty more examples of this, and of course it's all my opinion and you're free to disagree, but I think it's worth highlighting since the game is extremely fun, but still imperfect. There's tons of stuff that I haven't talked about here, but I'm saving some of that for later videos, so I'm going to end it here. If you liked it, press all of the YouTube algorithm buttons and tell me about your experiences with Dead by Daylight, because this game is incredible. Definitely the best asymmetrical multiplayer game on the market, and it's super popular right now, and I'm hoping it gets more popular. Despite all of my critique, the devs have made something amazing here, and I hope that they're able to keep it up in the future. The game has received many balance changes, almost all of which have been for the better, and hopefully that trend continues into the future. Thanks for watching.